Hi, welcome to today's video. My name is Paul. So this week I'm going to talk just a little bit about Neo-Impressionism. Neo-Impressionism was an art movement that came along sort of towards the end of Impressionism. So, if you go into like pop music, rock music, there were some very successful groups that split up. The Beatles split up, the Beach Boys split up, and so on and so on. And although they were very successful at their peak, they did eventually end up breaking up and going their separate ways. And this sort of thing happened in art as well. And it happened to the Impressionists. So the Impressionists had altogether 8 exhibitions. These were sort of independent exhibitions, separate from the government-sponsored Salon exhibition. Not all of the original Impressionist artists took part in the final exhibition or even the final few exhibitions. So on the screen you can see some of these artists. On the left you've got Monet, Renoir, Cézanne, looking a bit manic as he often did in photographs, and Alfred Sisley, looking very dapper in his that style of clothes that men wore back then. These 4 artists, they all took part in the early days, the early exhibitions, at least the first exhibition anyway. Cézanne kind of went off on a solo career, if you like, doing his own thing quite early on, but he did take part in the first exhibition. None of these artists took part in the 8th and final one. And part of the reason was Neo-Impressionism. So on the right, we have 2 more artists. You have the older man is Camille Pissarro. And I think he was maybe one of the few, or maybe the only original Impressionist who actually took part in each and every one of the 8 Impressionist exhibitions. And next to him is a younger artist. This is Seurat. I think it was George Seurat. And he is known as a neo-impressionist artist. And the style of art that they made, and you can see one of his most famous paintings underneath, was this pointillism, or sometimes called divisionism, where you have tiny dots of colour. Artists like Monet and Renoir refused to take part in the 8th exhibition because Pissarro had invited Seurat to take part, and also some of the other Neo-Impressionist artists. Pissarro himself experimented with this style of painting for a while, a few years, or at least a year, after which he decided to turn against it, and he decided that it wasn't a very good way of painting, but he was willing to at least experiment with it. People like Monet just no, he wanted nothing to do with it. Monet, Renoir and so on had kind of gone from being the outsiders to being the mainstream by this point, and they somewhat ironically rejected this younger artist who was coming along with something a bit different, and they rejected it as being not good art. I say ironic because that's kind of what happened to Renoir and Monet when they were young artists. But anyway, this Neo-Impressionism, it was a style of painting that required a huge amount of patience, I think. And it kind of somewhat mixed science and art. And that's another thing that put some people off. Some people didn't like introducing any kind of science into art. They saw it as 2 very different things, and they should always be separate. If you were to focus in on this sort of Neo-Impressionist style of painting, you can sort of see all of the little dots, the little points of paint that were applied. And I say it was based, at least in part, on science. There was this scientific paper that was published talking about colour and how we perceive colour. And one of the ideas in this scientific publication was the idea of complementary colours. So if you imagine the colour wheel, the complementary colours are colours that are opposite each other on the colour wheel. Red and green, purple and yellow, and so on. And this idea was that by putting complementaries near each other, next to each other, they built each other up. They kind of heightened the impact of each colour. The yellow next to the purple, the yellow looks more yellow, the purple looks more purple, this kind of idea. Now, whether this was true, whether the artists had actually interpreted the science correctly, is debatable, and we'll come back to that in a minute or two. But anyway, this was the idea. So complementary colours and this idea of optical mixing. So you're not mixing the colours on the palette and then applying to the canvas. Instead, you're just doing little dots of pure colour. The viewer, can't resolve each little dot. So when they step back, they all sort of start to merge together and you get this optical blending. The colours kind of merge together on the retina of the eye kind of thing. Or somewhere in your brain, perhaps. Couple more examples of this style of painting. On the left is an interesting historical painting because this is, of course, the Eiffel Tower in Paris, but it's being built. It's still being built. I think it was for World Fair or something like this in Paris in 18 something. And it was only meant to be a temporary structure, but well over 100 years, 150 years, whatever later, it's still there. And then on the right, sort of seascape, landscape type of painting. And you can see this sort of pointillism or divisionism, Neo-Impressionism, whatever you want to call it, it does create a certain look to the painting. It's sort of a still, almost like frozen in time sort of look. To me anyway, I don't know if that makes sense to other people, but this is the way I sort of see these paintings. I have mixed feelings about Neo-Impressionism. It's not something that I want to do. I would not have the patience to do this, but I do like some of the paintings. I like the aesthetic. Neo-Impressionism, again, is one of these art movements that was associated with politics, particularly left-wing politics, particularly anarchy and anarchists. And it spread it wasn't just a French art movement. It went beyond the borders of France into Italy and Belgium and the Netherlands and other places. And it was often, especially in these other places, it was depicting a little bit like realism. It was depicting peasants and more sort of downtrodden people in life, people who were struggling, and it had that sort of left-wing slant to it as well. Another example is, again, this idea of gleaning. The peasants get into the field and picking up whatever they can find. So this is, again, another example of this sort of realism. And by this stage, realism as an art movement was a little bit historical. It had happened decades earlier. But Neo-Impressionism kind of picked up the idea of realism again and ran with it a bit, although their style of painting was very different. And again, if you were to focus in on that previous example, you can see in the tree line you have reds and blues and greens and bits of orange in there. It's all those complementary colours. Little dots of complementary colours next to each other. I think to fully appreciate Neo-Impressionism, you kind of have to see it in real life. You have to get to a museum, an art gallery that actually has examples of this. And there are lots of galleries that have Neo-Impressionists artworks. But if you can see them in real life, it helps, I think. Photographs don't really do this art style justice. There were some other artists who are not really associated with Neo-Impressionism, but they did experiment a little bit. As I say, Camille Pissarro, one of the original Impressionist artists, he did play around with this divisionism or pointillism for a while, as did Vincent van Gogh, at least in one of his paintings. And this one is, I think Vincent painted this after Millet's painting the Sower, at least the English name. But you can see the influence of this sort of pointillism and this idea of complementary colours, blues and oranges and so on, next to each other. Vincent's style wasn't really points, he was doing more brushstrokes, but you get the idea. He was at least experimenting with this idea. And he was in Paris around about the sort of latter stages, 1870s, 1880s, that sort of time, before he moved to the south of France. So he would have probably come across some of these artists playing around with this Neo-Impressionism. Another example, this is one of my favorite Neo-Impressionist paintings. It's a very simple painting, but it's an example of where I think this style of painting works, at least for me. I like the aesthetic of this painting. A couple more examples. These are by, again, that artist Seurat. And these are, in the earlier days in his career, before he really got into the pointillism, he was developing or moving in that style. He didn't jump in straight away with that sort of pointillist style. It's something that developed. And if you ever get a chance to see his drawing style, it's also very unique. This painting is an example of Camille Pissarro, his attempts at pointillism. I say this pointillist style takes a long time to do, even a small painting, compared to Impressionist style, which is just loose, fast brushwork. You're just dabbing little bits of paint onto the canvas. Take forever to do even a small painting. Part of the problem then was that you couldn't sell as many paintings, which means, someone like Camille Pissarro, who was earning his living entirely as an artist, you have fewer paintings, therefore you have less income, and he had a big family to feed, and it got really quite serious at one point. His wife was thinking about sending away their older sons because she just couldn't feed them. And it was, there was no welfare state or anything back in those days. If you couldn't afford food, you starved to death. And that's the direction that Camille Pissarro and his family were heading in. And whether it was his wife or himself or whatever it was, Camille Pissarro decided to stop doing this and go back just to the Impressionist style that he'd been painting for many years before. And it worked, and he was able to sell paintings again and feed his family and so on. This is part of the reason why he turned against Neo-Impressionism and pointillism. And it was also because of the many rules that were associated with this art movement that I guess an Impressionist like Pissarro, it didn't really sit with him very naturally to have lots of rules. Impressionism was much more freestyle and didn't really have agendas or rules or anything like that. As I said, with this Neo-Impressionism was at least built partly on scientific research. However, the artists kind of misinterpreted the research. They believed that, using those complementary colors and the tiny dots of colors next to each other increased the luminosity of the painting. But the original research, the scientific research, was talking about this additive luminosity, and it was only applicable to colored lights, not to pigments on a piece of canvas. So the artists had kind of misinterpreted the original scientific stuff, at least in part. And maybe that is, one reason why science and art don't always go together. Artists may not be scientifically trained and vice versa. But anyway, the Neo-Impressionists did misinterpret the science. Again, you could pause the video and read through this if you want. It is an interesting topic. As I say, Camille Pissarro wasn't happy with all of the rules associated with Neo-Impressionism. And again, if you want to, you can pause it and go through it. These are some of the ideas, the rules, the agenda that the Neo-Impressionists tried to use in their artwork. And there are quite a few of them, certainly compared to Impressionism, which really didn't have any rules at all. So as I say, Neo-Impressionism, Pointillism, Divisionism, it's a very interesting art movement. It's associated with politics, particularly anarchism, left-wing politics, extreme left-wing politics maybe. A number of artists were involved, not just in France. It was one of the first more international art movements. And it did have a real impact on the development of some forms of modern art. And you see people like Matisse were still influenced by Pointillism long after it had sort of faded as an art movement. So it is interesting. I say art history is an interesting thing to get into, and you can learn a lot about the type of art that you want to make as well. If you made it this far in the video, thank you for watching and listening, and hopefully see you again in next week's video.